Hello, Jerry here. Welcome back to our study of the Old Testament book of Esther. In chapter 1, we met King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, and his queen Vashti. She was ousted because she refused the summons of the king, and was replaced by the Jewess Esther in chapter 2. But please don't tell Xerxes she's Jewish. It's extremely important that he learns this later. In chapter 3, we met Haman, the new prime minister, narcissistic, craving the worship of others. We also met Mordecai, the older cousin of Esther, who was her guardian and probably also her protector as a vulnerable orphan in exile. But then Mordecai became an empty nester. Esther was on her own in the palace as the queen, and he works in some government position. Now, Mordecai and Haman clash because Mordecai will not bow down to Haman, so Haman planned the genocide of all the Jews in the empire. Mordecai took his stand based upon his Jewish faith, perhaps because of the very worshipful demands of Haman, who was the least worthy of respect. But there may well have been another factor for this. Now, someone in Sunday school class brought out last week about Haman's ancestry with the Amalekites and King Agag back in 1 Samuel. And this week, a second person mentioned that to me, so these were good reminders for me to note the significant ancestry of Haman. Now, I'd like to quote the NIV Study Bible that summarizes this so well, because I would take much too long in trying to explain it. The title Agagite, that is, of Haman, could refer to some other immediate ancestor or to an unknown place. However, it is far more likely that it refers to Agag, king of Amalek. The Amalekites had attacked Israel after she fled from Egypt. For this reason, the Lord would, quote, be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. Israel was not to forget, but must, quote, blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, end quote. Saul's attack on Amalek results in the death of King Agag, king of Amalek, and most of the city's population. In Esther, about 500 years after, only the long-standing enmity between the Jews and the Amalekites accounts both for Mordecai's refusal and for Haman's intent to destroy all the Jews. The threat against the Jews throughout the whole kingdom is a threat against the ultimate issue of redemptive history. End quote. So, if King Saul would have obeyed the Lord's command concerning the Amalekites, there would have been no Haman, if indeed he was descended from the Amalekites. We can't really identify with this dynamic, can we? I mean, we've fought 2 wars with England, but we're good friends now. People in England welcome Americans and vice versa, and there's no Revolutionary War or War of 1812 bitterness lingering. But perhaps it was different with the Amalekite-Israel conflict, where the Amalekites first attacked Israel, who appears to have suffered some significant losses. But through the Lord, a large part of the Amalekite civilization was killed, a memorable conflict. And let me share a personal story. Many years ago, in the early 1990s, when I was teaching at a Bible college in New York, we had a handful of Russian Christians who visited our campus, and I was giving them a tour of the library I managed, and their English was pretty good. And when they heard my last name, Franz, which is German, one of them said very solemnly in front of everyone, "Your people invaded our country." He was very serious. I remember responding that the Franzes I'm related to came here from Germany in 1848, almost a century before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. But I could see that didn't matter. I was considered part of that nation. And though it was awkward I understood that to these Russians, World War II was not just an academic subject like it was to me. They appeared to be in their 30s and almost certainly lost members of their families at the grandparent and great-grandparent levels, because Russia lost 26.6 million people in the war against Germany, most of whom were civilians. Now that's over 63 times the number we lost in the war, 14 or 15% of their total population. But in the Ukraine and Belarus, which was more closer and more involved in the war conflict, they lost over 25% of their population. And they would know so many atrocity stories perpetrated by the Germans. To Mordecai and Haman, this history mattered. It's so easy for us to say, come on, let's let bygones be bygones, but we're armchair readers at a safe distance. As well, on Mordecai's part, God had stated clearly that Israel was, quote, at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation, end quote. So it's very possible, though not certain, that this was an additional dynamic in play. Now let's enter Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, that is, the decree of genocide against the Jews, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. We can see where the king's gate was and the entrance to the palace complex. Mordecai had no clout to change the decree. Hence his bold public mourning in sackcloth. It was his only way to be heard, and he will be heard. The verse said no one was permitted to enter the king's gate in sackcloth mourning, but Mordecai parked himself right at the gate, loudly wailing, tempting eager or feisty guards, probably. Now Haman must have taken pleasure in this public mourning and pain of Mordecai. It's exactly what he wanted, inward punishment and pain, until Mordecai's end months later, according to that decree. But Mordecai was not alone, and in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Here was the understandable national response of the Jews scattered throughout the land. In the Old Testament, fasting was always accompanied by prayer, unless this was the exception in Esther. Can we see how God was using this trial to bring his nation back to himself? There appeared to be no human remedy for the Jewish nation, because, of course, they did not know the queen was Jewish yet. Well, let's get psychologically closer to this. What would you do if you knew that next December, 11 months from now, on a certain day, you and your family and the entire population of professing Christianity in the United States, regardless of denomination, would be violently killed and all property and goods taken? Genocide in a day of a people group. The nation just swallowing them whole, with leaving no evidence behind. Well, the first thing we would do in the United States, we would launch a lot of political action for our rights. But imagine that the law was unchangeable. No congressional veto, no Supreme Court overturn, unalterable. Do you think this might inspire your prayer life a little, when there's no other recourse but God? And that Christians of all sorts in the United States might be looking to God for deliverance? When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, that is, about Mordecai, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. So God gave Esther great favor among all those around her, and that continued. Her servants were there for her, and they were discreet. So Esther quickly sent clothes to replace the sackcloth to save Mordecai from arrest, but he refused to be helped. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Esther called upon a higher-ranking servant, who also favors her and is discreet and trustworthy, and he was to hear Mordecai's story. "Why are you doing this, Mordecai?" She doesn't know. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. Mordecai had done his research, and opens up to this trusted servant with all the details. He even knows the amount of money Haman promised to the royal treasury to make this happen. He passes on a copy of the decree for the city of Susa to give to Esther. And last, Mordecai gives an urgent exhortation to Queen Esther, because Esther is the only Jewish person with access to the king. Mordecai presses Esther, "Speak to the king in behalf of her people," that is, the Jews. Now I love that. Mordecai could have said on behalf of our people, but he said her people. A nuance that emphasizes her responsibility and duty to act on the nation's behalf. So with this, we know that at least by now the servants know about the queen's Jewish ethnicity. The story now focuses upon Esther versus Haman, good versus evil, along with the king. And we cannot depend on the king to make the most wise and rational choice, can we? He's a terrible decision maker. So if the king is going to decide to help the Jews, it's got to be super clear and very persuasive. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Now Esther knows the news, and like the Jewish exiles, immediately felt helpless. She responded to Mordecai's urging to speak to the king. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. This setting is so filled with tension and urgency, and every minute Mordecai is right on the border of the king's gate, wailing and in sackcloth, is so risky for being arrested and punished, probably losing his government job. And there were these quick messages back and forth. Esther's first response to Mordecai's charge to speak to the king was an understandable and typical first reaction to a dangerous circumstance. What danger is there for me? She just can't walk into the king's presence unless summoned. That might mean death. So the overall answer to Mordecai was no, the risk is too high. Esther knows King Xerxes. He was an erratic and volatile leader. Now, let me pause here for a minute, just a minute, to consider two brief vignettes from history to illustrate this. When attacking Greece a few years earlier in 480 BC, while trying to cross the water at the Hellespont from Asia to Europe, a storm wrecked the clever pontoon bridge his engineers built. What was the king's response? The engineers were executed, and the waters publicly lashed, scolded, branded with hot irons, and last, chains and manacles thrown into the waters, all as judgments. I'm sure the waters greatly regretted the storm after that. Another story is of Xerxes on the same expedition being heroically rescued by his crew on his ship as the ship sank. But then later Xerxes executed them because the return journey took too long. So maybe we shouldn't assume that Xerxes would never execute Esther for approaching him uninvited. And it's interesting that Esther has not been in communication with Xerxes for a month, apparently. Mordecai sends an immediate answer. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai addresses Esther's answer concerning that dangerous risk. He says plainly, "There is already a great risk for you with this decree. Don't imagine you are safe in the palace. They're all in this together as Jews, no exceptions. And Esther was the only one with access. Nothing was more important than her grasping this." I think we should give Esther a little break here. She gets this horrific news, and then the charge to speak to the king. Her first response is learned protocol. We don't go in unless invited, or you can be killed. I think that was drummed into them. Mordecai replied that even with that risk, it should be done. Now, nobody was more precious to Mordecai than Esther, so it must have been very agonizing to urge her to an action that might cost her life. But the urgency of the decree demanded this. Mordecai also said confidently that relief and deliverance will come, if not from Queen Esther's work, then from someplace else. Well, who on earth would that be? There's no other human group in the Persian Empire or outside the empire that will come and rescue the Jews. This was just another of the many couched statements that pointed to God without saying the word. And third, Mordecai sends those immortal words, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Again, another verse that comes about as close as you can get without referring to God. That there was some almighty force in the world, above humanity, above nations, which had orchestrated Esther's position as queen, as a Jewess, during this decree of genocide against the Jews. And just what power would that be to a Jewish person like Mordecai? What a powerful moment this must have been for Queen Esther when reading or hearing those words. Judging by her initial response, she was not thinking in this way, of God placing her there for this very moment. Here is where all the lights came on for Esther, why she was netted into this large group of women for the harem, why all this favor by the servants, and finally favor by the king to take her as the queen. And now there is a firm decision by Esther back to Mordecai. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do." As we noted, you fasted to humble your soul and devote your whole undistracted self to God in prayer. Fasting was not a common standalone activity then, like it is today for health benefits. If you got sick from food, yes, you would fast from food in any era. Or if a family member or close friend passed, yes, one of the ways you expressed your mourning was by not eating. How could you eat and dress and groom well when this person had passed? It was inconsiderate. But fasting by itself was not a means to address or prepare for an emergency. I love that Esther noted that she and her women servants would fast as well. Esther had a great relationship with those many servants that attended her, and I'm sure they were greatly moved by her plight and were not rooting for Haman. Then her final words to Mordecai here. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Spoken like a noble queen, and I think of a person trusting in Almighty God. Queen Esther will risk death to approach the king, and if possible will go on to reveal her Jewish identity and plead for the nation. If she dies in the process, then she dies. Those words by Mordecai, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this, they hit their mark and helped inspire her faith response. And the equally immortal words, and if I perish, I perish. Next week, Lord willing, we'll enter chapter 5. Will Esther approach the king? Thanks very much.